For years, Japan's soldiers had been taught one truth: surrender was worse than death. They died by the thousands believing it. But in August 1945, a light brighter than the sun burned that truth to ash. From Saipan's cliffs to Tokyo's ruins, men who once swore never to kneel were forced to face what honor truly meant. One soldier's vow, forged in duty, shattered by Hiroshima, would question everything Japan believed about courage, loyalty, and the unbearable weight of survival. Let's figure out. August 1944. The island of Saipan. The wind carried salt from the Pacific. It stung the lips and filled the lungs of men who hadn't slept in 2 days. The beach was littered with twisted metal, broken rifles, helmets without owners, boots half buried in sand. A single figure stood at the edge of the bluff, his silhouette outlined by the pale dawn. Second Lieutenant Kobayashi tightened the strap of his helmet and whispered a quiet prayer to the rising sun. He was 24, born in Kyoto, raised in a quiet house behind a temple. He had grown up with stories of his great-grandfather who served in the Meiji Wars. His father used to say, "A man's worth is measured by how he meets death." Those words had followed him through cadet school, through the brutal drills and the endless lectures about Bushido, the way of the warrior. To live without honor was worse than dying with it. In the early hours, the men gathered for inspection. Mud streaked their uniforms. Exhaustion clung to them like dust. No one complained. Complaining was weakness. They saluted, voices hoarse as they shouted the emperor's name. Kobayashi's heart thumped hard in his chest. The roar of the surf drowned the echo of the salute. "Sir," a private asked quietly after the formation, "if the Americans reach us here, will we surrender?" The question cut through the humid air like a blade. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Sergeant Watanabe turned sharply. "We do not surrender," he said, eyes hard as obsidian. "Not while we live." The young private lowered his head. He knew what happened to men who asked the wrong questions. That night, Kobayashi opened his journal by the flickering light of an oil lamp. The pages were spotted with sand. He wrote, "The men are afraid. I am afraid. But fear is not failure. To fear death is human. To surrender to it, unforgivable." Beyond the ridgeline, artillery flared, brief suns in the darkness. Each explosion rolled through his bones. He had seen what happened to prisoners taken by American forces on Guam. Leaflets warned that captured soldiers were treated decently, but Japanese propaganda said otherwise, that the enemy mutilated captives, that surrender was humiliation worse than torture. Kobayashi didn't know which to believe. The truth no longer mattered. Belief was what kept men fighting. By the third week, supplies were gone. Rice rations were reduced to a handful per man. The wounded lay in dugouts, murmuring in fever dreams. Still, no one talked of giving up. They waited for an order that would never come. One evening, as the sun bled red into the Pacific, Kobayashi walked among the wounded. A young corporal, barely 19, gripped his hand and whispered, "Sir, will our families know we died well?" "They will," Kobayashi replied, though he wasn't sure anymore what well meant. The corporal smiled faintly, his fingers cold. "Then I am ready." That night, the unit received an order, the final assault. They were to charge the American positions at dawn, armed with bayonets and grenades, to die as soldiers of the emperor. It wasn't strategy, it was ritual. The kind of charge meant to prove loyalty, not to win. In the pre-dawn stillness, Kobayashi tied a white headband around his brow. The silk was printed with a red sun. His men lined up, faces pale in the dim light. Some muttered prayers, others stared silently ahead. The sergeant handed each a grenade. "One for them," he said. "One for yourself." The horizon began to glow. Kobayashi's heartbeat matched the waves. "Men," he said, his voice trembling just enough for them to hear he was still human. "We fight for the Emperor, for Japan, and for each other. If we fall together." They charged into the gunfire. The first minutes were chaos, smoke, sand, shouting. Kobayashi felt the sting of shrapnel in his shoulder. Around him, the beach turned to fire. By mid-morning, it was over. Half his men were gone. The rest lay scattered, faces turned toward the sky. He crawled behind a shattered bunker, clutching his wound, the world spinning. He thought of Kyoto, of the sound of his mother's laugh, of the temple bell that rang every dawn. Somewhere behind him, Watanabe's voice called out, hoarse but defiant, "We will not yield." Then silence. When night fell, the beach smelled of smoke and iron. Kobayashi sat alone, his body aching, his rifle empty. He looked at the stars and wondered if any of them could see Japan. He whispered, "We did not surrender." But deep inside, a small voice answered back, one he had never allowed himself to hear. And what did that save? He pushed the thought away, clutching his rifle tighter. He didn't know it then, but the code he lived by, the one that made surrender worse than death, was already beginning to crack. And the crack would widen until it swallowed everything he believed in. Across the empire, the belief ran deeper than steel. From the barracks of Hokkaido to the jungles of the Philippines, Japanese soldiers carried an invisible armor, Bushido. To die for the emperor was glory. To be captured was shame. ... In training camps, recruits were broken and rebuilt. They were taught to strike without hesitation, to obey without question, to consider the enemy less than human. They were told the Americans would humiliate and defile them if captured. Fear was replaced by fanatic resolve. Better to die like a shattered jewel than live as a broken tile, one instructor had told Kobayashi's class years before. The phrase Gyokusai became doctrine. On islands like Iwo Jima, thousands followed it to the letter. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders there, fewer than 300 were taken alive. The rest chose death, some by grenade, some by blade. Propaganda posters at home showed soldiers smiling as they charged tanks with bayonets. Newspapers printed stories of heroic last stands. Mothers told their sons, "Bring no shame to the family name." Even school children were drilled to prefer death over surrender. The army enforced it ruthlessly. In Manchuria, officers executed men suspected of cowardice. On Okinawa, civilians were told to leap from cliffs rather than be captured. Many did. The belief wasn't born from madness. It came from centuries of cultural myth, samurai codes, emperor worship, and national indoctrination that merged loyalty with identity. For a soldier like Kobayashi, surrender wasn't just disobedience. It was erasure of self, of family, of everything sacred. After Saipan fell, Kobayashi and a handful of survivors were transferred to the Philippines. Their uniforms were ragged, their stomachs empty. But the spirit, the unbreakable mind, remained. "The Americans think we fear death," Watanabe said one evening by the campfire. "They don't understand. Death is our companion." Yet even as he spoke, the world around them was collapsing. The Imperial Navy had been crippled at Leyte Gulf. The skies above Tokyo glowed red each night from incendiary raids. Still, radio broadcasts insisted Japan was advancing steadily. Lies became the air they breathed. Kobayashi watched as new recruits arrived, thin boys of 16, trembling with patriotism. He tried to teach them discipline, courage, belief, but he saw the doubt in their eyes. They had heard the rumors, American bombers flying unchallenged, islands falling one by one, officers whispering about defeat. One night, a private asked him, "Sir, what if surrender isn't shame? What if it's mercy?" Kobayashi froze. The fire crackled between them. "Mercy?" he repeated, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. "Mercy is for the strong. We have orders. We fight until there's nothing left." The boy nodded but didn't look convinced. When the Americans invaded Luzon, the jungle erupted. Days blurred into nights. Men starved, rotted, disappeared. Kobayashi's diary entries grew shorter. Food, none. Rain, constant. Morale, holding. Yet the belief held. When captured comrades tried to surrender, they were branded traitors. Some were shot by their own officers. Others simply vanished into the jungle, choosing to die unseen. That was the unbreakable mindset. Not strength, but imprisonment inside one's own code. The men fought ghosts, the ghost of honor, the ghost of shame, the ghost of the emperor watching from a distant palace. Sometimes at night, Kobayashi dreamed of home. His mother's voice would call, "Come back alive." He'd wake in a sweat, ashamed of the dream. Alive was not the goal. Alive was dishonor. When he closed his eyes, he saw faces, young, terrified, and loyal to an idea they barely understood. The training had promised them clarity. The war delivered only confusion. And still, they fought on. Because the alternative, surrender, was unthinkable. By early 1945, the Japanese army's situation was desperate. Entire divisions had been wiped out. Ammunition and food were gone. Yet official communiques still spoke of spiritual victory. Kobayashi realized something one humid afternoon as he stood beside Watanabe, watching smoke rise from a distant village. They had mistaken fanaticism for faith. "We are ghosts already," Watanabe murmured. "We just haven't fallen yet." The radio crackled that night. Tokyo spoke of a new weapon the enemy may use. No details, no name, only a warning. Kobayashi stared into the darkness, unaware that this cryptic message was the first whisper of Hiroshima, a flash that would soon expose every lie they'd been told. Spring 1945 arrived like a whisper of something broken. The war that once roared with conviction now trembled in exhaustion. Japan's empire, once stretching across the Pacific, was collapsing, one island after another, falling into silence. But for the soldiers still clinging to the jungles and coasts, the truth came not in orders, but in rumors. Lieutenant Kobayashi sat beneath a torn canvas tarp somewhere north of Manila, pen pressed against his notebook. The paper was damp, the ink fading. "No rice for 3 days," he wrote. "Rain for 5. Morale uncertain." He hesitated over the last word. Uncertain. It wasn't allowed to be written. It meant weakness, doubt, disease of the spirit. Outside, thunder rolled, but it wasn't thunder. It was artillery, distant but relentless. Each echo felt like the heartbeat of a dying empire. In the camps, whispers replaced commands. Some said the Imperial Navy had been destroyed at Leyte Gulf. Others murmured that Tokyo itself burned, that entire districts were turned to ash by the new American firebombs. The radio, when it worked, told a different story. Our forces advance courageously. The sacred land of the emperor remains untouched. Everyone knew it was a lie, but no one dared speak it aloud. That night, Sergeant Watanabe sat beside Kobayashi, sharpening his bayonet with slow, deliberate strokes. The steel scraped like a whisper. "We trained for victory," Watanabe said quietly, "but no one trained us for defeat." Kobayashi didn't answer. He couldn't, because deep down he understood. The very idea of defeat was forbidden. To lose was dishonor. To surrender was sin. Yet the signs were everywhere. The supply lines were gone. Wounded men lay feverish, their uniforms stiff with blood and mud. They talked in half-dreams, murmuring names of wives, sisters, children. The jungle smelled of rot and gunpowder. Then came the Soviet news. One humid August night, a runner arrived, barefoot, bleeding, eyes wild. "The Russians!" he gasped. "They've crossed into Manchuria. They're attacking our northern army." The words rippled through the camp like wind through dry grass. Some stared blankly. Others cursed under their breath. Kobayashi looked up from his map, trying to make sense of it. "Both sides?" he whispered. "Now we fight both sides." No one replied. They didn't need to. Everyone knew what it meant. Japan was surrounded, crushed between fire and iron. A few days later, a strange report reached them. American bombers had dropped a single weapon on a city called Hiroshima. The details were unclear. Some said the entire city had burned in seconds. Others that a new chemical gas had been released. The officers dismissed it as propaganda. "No weapon can do that," one said. "They exaggerate to break our spirit." But Kobayashi remembered the runner's eyes, how he'd trembled when he spoke. Something about that fear didn't feel exaggerated. As the weeks bled together, soldiers began disappearing into the jungle. Some deserted to look for food. Others, no one said it, but they knew, walked into the trees and never came back. Kobayashi still clung to the code. "We will not surrender," he told his men. "The emperor watches us. We endure." But even his voice sounded different now, strained, thin. At dusk, the air buzzed with insects. The radio crackled again. "Tokyo command." Static swallowed the words. Then a brief message broke through. "A new weapon. Hiroshima. Unprecedented destruction. Maintain order." Then silence. Watanabe stared at Kobayashi. "Unprecedented destruction," he repeated. What does that mean? Kobayashi didn't know. But the word unprecedented settled in his chest like a stone. He wrote it in his notebook, underlined it twice. Later that night, he dreamed of his hometown, of streets lined with paper lanterns, of the temple bell echoing over Kyoto's hills. In the dream, the bell sound changed, became an explosion, white and blinding. He woke drenched in sweat, gasping for air. Morning brought a strange calm. No bombers in the sky, no orders from command, just silence, the kind that made you feel the earth itself was holding its breath. He stood beside Watanabe, staring toward the horizon. Smoke from distant fires painted the sky a pale red. "Maybe this is how the world ends," Watanabe murmured. Kobayashi didn't reply. For the first time, he didn't know which was worse, defeat or the silence that followed it. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the sky over the city was a perfect blue. Children were walking to school, office clerks unlocking their doors, soldiers heading to morning drills. Then, a light brighter than the sun. A silence so total, It swallowed every sound on Earth. In the next instant, everything changed. Kobayashi was 200 miles away, near a ruined airstrip in Kyushu. At noon, the radio operator, his hands shaking, called for attention. "Hiroshima, gone," he said. The men laughed at first. "Gone?" someone scoffed. "You mean bombed?" The operator didn't answer. He simply turned the dial higher. Static roared. Then a faint voice broke through. Strained, terrified. "The city. It's gone." Kobayashi leaned closer, trying to comprehend. How could a city be gone? He imagined firestorms, explosions, block after block consumed by flames. But this was different. The reports spoke of shadows burned into walls, of bodies turned to ash in an instant, of silence where screams should have been. By evening, word spread through every unit. A single bomb had done what thousands of air raids never could. The code of Bushido, the unyielding faith in courage and death, met something it couldn't explain. How do you fight an enemy who wields the power of the sun? That night, Kobayashi sat alone outside his bunker. The horizon flickered faintly. He could almost imagine the glow of Hiroshima far beyond the clouds. The air smelled of rain, of iron, of endings. Watanabe joined him, lowering himself slowly beside the fire. Neither spoke for a while. The only sound was the crackling wood. Finally, Watanabe said, "They say everyone there is gone." Kobayashi nodded. "A new weapon," he whispered. "A weapon that erases cities," Watanabe murmured. "Then what is honor now?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. 3 days later, another message crackled through the static. Nagasaki, another city gone, another flash. Even the most loyal officers stopped speaking of victory. Command posts buzzed with disbelief, denial, despair. "We must negotiate," some said. "Never," shouted others. "We die fighting." In Tokyo, chaos reigned. The emperor's advisors argued behind closed doors. The army ministers still demanded resistance. Others, like Foreign Minister Togo, urged surrender before the entire nation ceased to exist. Among the rank and file, fear took a shape it had never taken before. Not of death, but of annihilation without meaning. Death had always been sacred. Now it felt pointless. Kobayashi watched his men as they huddled under makeshift tarps during a summer downpour. They were thinner than ever, eyes hollow. Some prayed, others stared blankly at the mud. He thought of Hiroshima, how a single bomb had turned the very concept of battle into absurdity. For years, he had been taught that courage could triumph over any weapon. But courage couldn't stop the sun. That night, a corporal approached him, voice trembling. "Sir," he said, "is it true the emperor might surrender?" Kobayashi hesitated. The question was blasphemy only months ago. But now, "If he does," he said quietly, "it will be because he wishes us to live." The corporal swallowed hard. "Do we still fight?" Kobayashi looked at the dark jungle beyond the camp, where fireflies blinked like distant embers. "No," he said finally, "we wait." When he returned to his tent, he opened his journal again. A city destroyed in a single instant. The gods have left the earth. He closed the notebook and stared into the dark. He thought of his mother's temple, of the bell that once signaled morning prayers. What sound would it make now, if the city itself had vanished? Outside, the radio hissed again. "This weapon can destroy all life," a faint announcer said. "Civilians, hospitals, gone." Kobayashi covered his face with his hands. For the first time in the war, he cried. Not for victory lost, but for humanity undone. In the days that followed, the soldiers moved as if sleepwalking. Orders arrived, prepare to defend Kyushu from invasion. But no one believed the invasion would come. Something deeper was happening. The spirit that once bound them to the Emperor's code was dissolving under the light of Hiroshima. Watanabe said it aloud one evening. We thought surrender was dishonor. But after this, after Hiroshima, maybe surrender is the only honor left. No one argued. The jungle is quiet. Even the cicadas had stopped singing. Somewhere above, clouds drifted across the moon. Kobayashi looked up and whispered, If the Emperor speaks, I will obey, but I will not die for ghosts. He didn't know it yet, but the Emperor was preparing to speak, to shatter a silence that had defined a generation. August 15th, 1945. Noon approached over Japan, and for the first time in its history, the Emperor's voice was about to be heard. In every barracks, bunker, and shattered ruin across the Pacific, soldiers gathered around radios, their uniforms torn, their faces gaunt, their spirits suspended between disbelief and dread. They didn't know what he would say. Some whispered prayers. Others clutched their rifles as if expecting one final order to die. Lieutenant Kobayashi stood among his men in a dim hut, the air thick with humidity and anticipation. The radio hissed and crackled. Then, through the static, came a faint, trembling voice, soft, deliberate, almost otherworldly. It was the Emperor himself. For a moment, no one breathed. The words were formal, distant, and heavy with meaning few immediately understood. He spoke of enduring the unendurable, of a new and most cruel bomb, of saving the seeds of the nation. He never used the word surrender, but everyone understood. When the broadcast ended, silence followed, a silence more profound than any explosion. Watanabe was the first to speak. It's over, he whispered. Kobayashi said nothing. He simply stared at the radio, feeling the weight of generations shift. The war that had defined his entire adulthood, that had consumed millions of lives and entire cities, was finished. Not with victory, not even with defeat, but with the quiet voice of a god-king who had chosen life over extinction. Outside, rain began to fall. Men removed their helmets, some crying openly, others bowing their heads. A few screamed in rage, tearing at their uniforms, shouting that the Emperor's words were a trick, an enemy broadcast meant to deceive. But those voices faded quickly. Kobayashi walked outside, letting the rain soak through his uniform. He thought of Hiroshima, of the flash that erased a city, of the second bomb at Nagasaki. He thought of the Emperor's phrase, a new and most cruel bomb. There was no other word for it. Somewhere behind him, Watanabe spoke softly. We fought for honor. Now we must live with shame. Kobayashi turned to him. No, he said. We must live with memory. That night, he wrote in his journal, The Emperor has spoken. The sword has been sheathed. But I no longer know who I am without it. Across the country, similar scenes unfolded. Some units obeyed instantly, laying down their arms. Others refused, unable to comprehend a Japan that would bow to the enemy. On remote islands, Entire garrisons continued to fight for weeks, even months, unaware or unwilling to believe the war was truly over. In Tokyo, the fires still smoldered from the bombings. Civilians knelt before broken radios, weeping. A few took their lives, believing surrender was worse than death. But in the ruins, a strange feeling also emerged. Relief. For the first time in years, no bombs fell. The sky was quiet. The children, those who still had homes, dared to step outside again. For Kobayashi and his men, that quiet felt heavier than any battlefield. They sat together in the dark, eating the last of their rations. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. When dawn came, the rising sun broke through the mist. The same symbol that had adorned their flags, their helmets, their dreams. But now, it looked different. Pale, tired, human. And for the first time, Kobayashi realized that even the sun could surrender to the clouds. The weeks after surrender were not peace. They were something stranger, a limbo between worlds. Japan lay in ruins, cities flattened, rail lines twisted, millions displaced. The smell of ash hung in the air like memory itself. For soldiers like Kobayashi, the war had ended, but their battle had not. Now came the struggle to reconcile duty with survival, honor with the unbearable truth of defeat. When the American occupation began, leaflets rained down from the skies, written in Japanese and English. "Lay down your arms. The Emperor commands it." Some soldiers obeyed instantly. Others fled into the forests, still convinced it was a trick. A few drew their swords and ended their own lives. Kobayashi chose neither. He gathered his remaining men, buried their weapons beneath a cedar tree, and said quietly, "We obey the Emperor. We live." But living was not simple. The civilians they once vowed to protect now looked at them with a mixture of pity and resentment. The uniforms that had once inspired pride now brought shame. Watanabe spent his days wandering the ruined villages, trading scraps for rice. He returned one evening with tears in his eyes. "The people," he said, "they bow to Americans now. They call them liberators." Kobayashi stared into the fire. "Perhaps they are," he murmured. He didn't say what haunted him most, the image of Hiroshima. Reports trickled in, each one worse than the last. Hospitals overflowing with the burned, survivors walking like ghosts with their skin hanging loose, children crying for parents who had turned to ash. A visiting monk described it to him later. "The ground still glows," the monk said. "Even the rivers are dead." Kobayashi listened in silence, feeling something fracture inside him. How could honor exist in a world capable of that kind of destruction? How could Bushido, a code of courage, loyalty, and death, survive in a time when death came not from battle, but from invisible fire? One evening, a young soldier approached him. "Sir," he said, "my brother died in Hiroshima. They said he was vaporized. Does that mean nothing remains?" Kobayashi looked at the boy. "Nothing you can see," he said softly, "but everything that matters remains." The boy frowned. "What remains?" Kobayashi touched his chest. "The knowing, the remembering. That is what we must carry now." That became their new code. Not Bushido, but Kizuna, the bond between those who endured. As autumn turned to winter, the Americans arrived. Their trucks rolled through the roads like steel ghosts. Some soldiers bowed to them. Others looked away. Kobayashi did neither. He simply watched. One American officer, young and clean-shaven, approached him one afternoon. Through an interpreter, he asked, "Were you in combat?" Kobayashi nodded. The officer hesitated. "You fought well." Kobayashi studied his face, searching for mockery, but found none. Just fatigue, the same exhaustion he saw in his own reflection. "Then perhaps," Kobayashi said quietly, "we both lost something worth fighting for." The officer said nothing. He simply extended a cigarette. Kobayashi accepted it. Two former enemies shared a moment of silence beneath a sky finally free of bombs. That night, Kobayashi wrote in his journal, "War ends when memory begins, but memory is its own battlefield." Years later, Japan rebuilt. Streets rose from rubble. Children laughed again. Neon lights replaced bonfires. But for the men who lived through it, men like Lieutenant Kobayashi, the echoes of that summer never truly faded. He worked in a small railway office in Kyoto, his uniform long replaced by a gray suit. But every August, when the cicadas began to sing, he couldn't shake the memories. He'd pause in the middle of his work and hear the faint hiss of radios, the tremor of that distant voice, the emperor's speech, still echoing across time. In the evenings, he walked along the riverbanks, watching the paper lanterns float downstream during Obon, the festival of the dead. Each lantern carried a name, a soul remembered. Among them, he imagined the faces of his men. Watanabe, the young soldier with the lost brother, the ones who never came back. Sometimes, children would ask him about the war. "Were you a hero?" they'd say. He'd smile faintly. "No," he'd answer. "Heroes die young. I just lived long enough to remember." In 1946, he visited Hiroshima for the first time. The city was quiet, eerily so. Charred stones where schools once stood, the skeleton of the dome silhouetted against the morning sky. A few survivors wandered the ruins, their eyes distant. He knelt near the riverbank, where once thousands had tried to escape the flames. The air felt heavy, sacred. A small girl, perhaps 6 years old, approached him. She held a paper crane. "For peace," she said simply. Kobayashi took it gently. "Peace," he repeated. The word felt foreign in his mouth, but he said it again, softer this time, like a prayer. For the rest of his life, he carried that paper crane in his wallet. In time, the world called Hiroshima a warning, a lesson carved into the ashes of a city. But for Kobayashi, it was more than that. It was the day the meaning of honor changed forever. He wrote one final entry in his journal before he died. "We believed surrender was dishonor, but we were wrong. The true dishonor was the blindness that made surrender impossible until the sun itself burned our cities. We fought for an emperor. We survived for each other." When his family found the journal, the last page was stained with rain, or perhaps tears. And though his body was gone, his words endured, passed down through generations that would grow up never hearing bombs, never bowing to orders carved in steel, because in the end, the men who once feared surrender learned the hardest truth of all, that survival, too, can be an act of courage.